All right, hey everybody, welcome back. Today's flip lesson, we're going to be talking about section 3 of chapter 13, where we talk about mutations. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to do these, and you should know at least these key terms. All right, so when we talk about mutations, a lot of the times when people think about mutations, you think about these guys, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, or evil monsters that take over the world and some superhero has to fight them. But when we talk about mutations, how they actually happen in nature, they're actually very subtle, small changes. Okay, they're not Ninja Turtles running around with pizzas and hanging out with rats in sewers. Okay, so a mutation is a heritable change in genetic information. And basically, this is any change that can happen to the DNA, right, to that hereditary information. Any change that's going to happen from normal, right, from what's passed down from a mother cell to a daughter cell, any change in that is considered a mutation. All right. And there's two types of mutations that we could talk about. Okay, the first one is when there's a change in a single gene, and obviously this is called a gene mutation, right? So this happens in just a single gene. And remember, there are many genes in one chromosome. Okay, so there are many, many different genes or categories in one chromosome. The second type then is called a chromosomal mutation. All right, and this is a change that happens within an entire chromosome, right? So there's many, many genes on a chromosome. A chromosomal mutation is when we can have a change throughout that whole chromosome. So the first example here on the left is a gene mutation. Okay, and what this is we actually change just one nucleotide base pair, right? So this is our DNA molecule. These are all our different base pairs in here, A, T, C, G, etc. And if we accidentally miss one up, okay, or if we change one of these base pairs, just one chemical, right, that would be a gene mutation because it's only affecting a certain gene, a certain length of this chromosome. Let's say the gene starts here and ends here. If we only change this one base pair, we're only affecting that one gene, right? All the other genes over here are okay, and all the other genes on this side are okay. And this is different than a chromosomal mutation, whereas we see here on the right, where I'll label it C, okay, a chromosomal mutation refers to a change in that whole chromosome. For example, in this first one here, we actually severed off a piece of the chromosome. So now this chromosome, right, is missing all the information from here on up because this guy left. And if that holds really important information for processes of life, that organism's not going to survive, okay? And a different example would be instead of now one chromosome, what happens if we accidentally make two extra copies, right? Now we have three chromosomes with all those genes. Again, this is a chromosomal mutation because we're actually changing the number or the amount of chromosomes. So let's start off by talking about gene mutations, okay? So a gene mutation is often referred to as a point mutation because this mutation only happens at one point along the gene on the chromosome. Okay, and there's a couple different types of point mutations that we could talk about. The first one is called a substitution. All right, and a substitution is basically where we substitute one base pair for another. So for example, here we have this sequence of nucleotides, CTGGAG, and a substitution would be by accident, maybe the DNA polymerase makes a mistake when it's copying, and it replaces this A, it substitutes it with a G. Okay, now a lot of times this is not going to have any effect at all, or it will have minimal effect. At most, a substitution will usually affect just one amino acid in the polypeptide chain. Amino acid. Okay, so at most this is going to affect one amino acid in that polypeptide chain. Especially, right, it's only going to affect that one amino acid if it's the last letter of a codon. So remember, a codon is that three-letter code, that three-letter word in our DNA. And so let's say the original codon here was CGA, or excuse me, GGA, and now it's GGG. Usually, it's only going to affect that one amino acid, maybe because it's the last letter of the codon. Again, it's kind of by chance. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. We'll talk about how it could have bigger implications in a second here. The other types of point mutations is insertion and deletion. Okay, so when we insert as the name says, right, we're actually inserting an extra nucleotide. So here we see CTGAGT, and when we inserted an extra T right here, because now we have CTGATGT. Again, this insertion hopefully may only cause one amino acid to change. We'll talk about how that sometimes is not the case in a second. And then a deletion, obviously, is when we take one out, okay? We have CTGAGT, and now we go CTGGT, all right? This can a lot of times result in what we call a frame shift mutation, okay? So these insertions and deletions can result in a frame shift mutation. If we think about a frame shift, we're going to shift the entire frame of the DNA. If we remember, right, we read DNA and turn it into RNA, and these were called codons, right? Codons have 3 letters, and each combination of 3 letters can result in a different amino acid, okay? So if we insert or delete a nucleotide, we can actually shift the whole frame of reading for the strand of DNA, okay? Let's look at this top one here for an insertion. Our first codon is CTG, okay? Our second one would be AGT, right? They code for 2 totally different amino acids. But let's say we inserted that letter T, right? Now our first codon is CTG. The second one is now ATG, right? Which is different than AGT. We see the same thing down here for a deletion, right? Our original is CTG. Our second is AGT. If we take one away, now we have CTG, and our second codon is no longer AGT, it's GT, and then whatever the next one is, let's call it a C, okay? So these insertions and deletions could cause a huge problem in the DNA because they're going to shift the entire frame of that basically chromosome, of that DNA molecule. You're going to affect plenty of genes here because now it's kind of like reading one off. Imagine if you had a paragraph and then you took a period or a comma and you moved it all 2 words ahead. Your paragraph would not make sense, okay? So these insertion and deletions are also what we call frame shift mutations, okay? And they could be very bad for organisms because they could basically change all the proteins on this one chromosome, this one section of DNA. And if you change the proteins and they don't work correctly, you're not going to survive. Okay, so let's talk about chromosomal mutations now. Again, a chromosomal mutation is when we have a mutation that affects the whole chromosome, right? Not just one nucleotide base pair. Okay, so as we say here, right, we're affecting the whole chromosome, not just the base pair. And the first one's called a deletion. And this is when we actually delete a whole section of chromosome, right? Let's, for these couple slides here, pretend that this is a section of chromosome, right? This right here between C and D would be the centromere, and then we'd have another half come in here after we replicate, okay? So let's pretend a deletion, right, is we actually delete not just one nucleotide like in a gene mutation, but a whole section of chromosome, right? We see here the original chromosome, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, or excuse me, E, F, right? Let's say we deleted section B. So the new chromosome with a deletion looks like A, C, D, E, F, right? We just deleted a whole chunk of genes in here, which is not good sometimes, depending on if it codes for specific necessary proteins, okay? Our next type is called a duplication. And as the name states here, this is when we duplicate. From here, we went from our original chromosome. Now we have 2 sections of B's. Okay? Our third one is called an inversion. So here we go A, B, C, D, E, F. And once it's inverted, we go A, C, B, D, F. Okay, so an inversion, think about it, a flipping and out of order of that sections of chromosome. And then finally, the next one is a translocation. Okay, so here we have A, B, C, D, E, F. And let's say we have sections G and H that come from a totally separate chromosome. Somehow they get snipped off and they end up between B and C here. So now we have A, B, G, H, C, D, E, F. Okay, a translocation. We're taking a chunk of chromosome from another spot and putting it into our chromosome. Okay, so these are our types of chromosomal mutations. And we see why they're called chromosomal because they affect this whole chromosome. Now, compared to gene mutations, they're not necessarily better or worse, but we can definitely agree that they are much, much bigger, right? Think about it. In a gene mutation, I took that one little nucleotide base pair, boop, right here and switched it with something. Maybe it had an effect, maybe it didn't. With chromosomal mutations, you can definitely see the potential for more of an effect, right? A bigger effect because we're taking whole chunks of genes, right? 10, 15 genes maybe, and moving them around, deleting them, flip-flopping them. And you can see where that'd be an issue, right? Let's say there was a necessary protein that was made right here on the edge of A and going into B, and now all of a sudden you delete B and you go from A to C, okay, you can have huge trouble there. So chromosomal mutations have potential for either doing a lot of harm or changing an organism significantly. So some of these effects of these chromosomes, right? Genetic material can be altered by natural events or by artificial means. So we'll talk about how some of these mutations happen in a second. Sometimes they just happen by accident. Sometimes it's something in nature. And they're not always bad, right? A mutation is not necessarily a bad thing that's going to cause an organism to die right away. Yes, sometimes if an organism can't make a protein now because it's had a chromosomal mutation, that protein, the gene for that protein was deleted, obviously it's going to die. But sometimes it can be a good thing, right? Let's pretend we had these two birds here, okay, and they both originally had short beaks, but then this guy over here, bird number two, okay, let's say bird number two had a translocation of a certain gene that then made it so it was expressed more, and that gene made his beak grow longer, okay? Obviously, bird number two is going to be able to eat a lot more worms because he could reach in here and grab them. And this is going to be advantageous, okay? So this mutation actually may have helped bird number two to grow a longer beak and be able to eat more. So it's not always bad, right? Sometimes mutations can be a very good thing, and they often are one of the causes for that power of phenomenon we call evolution, okay? So mutations are often very crucial for evolution over time. All right. Um, so there's really two major ways that we'll say that these mutations, both gene and chromosomal mutations, can happen. The first one, and I'll write it because it got whited out here, is called a mutagen. Okay, and a mutagen uh, is something that can cause a mutation, and it's a chemical or physical environment or agent in the environment, right? And some of these things are things you've heard of before that you know may cause changes in your DNA, changes in your chromosomes that cause things like cancer or birth defects, right? One example would be radiation, right? Coming from the sun, coming from X-rays, gamma rays, all these different types of energy. You know that if you lay out in the sun too much and you don't wear sunscreen like this lady, right, you're going to get skin cancer, okay? That sun is going to change the chromosomes, change the DNA in your skin cells and cause it to have cancer, right? An example of a mutagen. Some chemicals are mutagens that get into your cells, get into the nuclei of your cells and change it and could cause cancer or other things, right? Cigarette smoke, all the toxic chemicals in cigarettes. Believe it or not, some different types of nitrates and chemicals in processed meats or preserved foods, like hot dogs, can actually be a mutagen. Stuff, and if you take your acne medicine when you go home and you look at benzoyl peroxide, okay, this is a chemical that's used in a lot of face cleaning products. That could also be a mutagen. Now, that doesn't mean don't go wash your face, all right? It's not going to instantly cause cancer, but it's something that you would want to use in moderation, right? Any type of chemical that can change your DNA, change your chromosome, is considered a mutagen. So that first way in which we could have mutations is through mutagens, okay? And the second way here is just kind of naturally in your cell, okay? It occurs naturally, and I like to think of it as a mistake, okay? A mistake in cellular processes, right? Usually by your DNA polymerase. And as we all know, the DNA polymerase is the enzyme that's responsible for copying that DNA strand, right? Especially when we talk about gene mutations, point mutations. sometimes that DNA polymerase puts in the wrong base, right? We all make mistakes every once in a while, so he'll do a substitution, okay? He might do an insertion or a deletion and accidentally delete a nucleotide. Sometimes when our nucleus is dividing, right, our chromosomes don't separate properly, and that would cause a chromosomal mutation. All right, so there's really two major ways. These mutagens are things that come from the environment that can be harmful, and then mutations happen naturally, right? Whether it's a DNA polymerase making a mistake or during the anaphase and the pulling apart of your chromosomes, that the chromosomes can actually change. We'll have chromosomal mutations. All right, so that's the end. Quite a bit of stuff. Review, go over it, make sure you have good notes. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me or tweet at me. All right, kids, have a great one.